for this show. It's a little different for us than most shows because Mike and I usually curate our shows here at the gallery. And there's was a little bit of chance in bringing the three artists in this exhibition together. All three artists were first prize winners from our juried exhibitions from the past 3 years. And we're really excited to have them. And they'll give a talk about their work and where they've come from in the past and how they got to this point, and then we'll open it up to questions. So Laura and Claire and Joyce unfortunately is not here this afternoon, but we'll give a round of applause. Claire, if you want to start.
Oh, yeah, sure. It's great. Well, I feel like the work in the show encompassed two very different directions in my studio that I was trying to do. It might not be obvious to the outside viewer, but for this piece down here, I intentionally went in it to overwork a painting. So I started it, wanted to put a lot in it and just work it until it was dead, and then keep working it until it came back to life again. And so I have like photos and I document the whole process with like how many like fabrics I took out or objects I put in and then like moved it around. Yes, it was very time consuming and it was a little obsessive and it kind of drove me nuts. And then so after that, I loved it, learned a lot. But the smaller pieces, I decided to do the complete opposite, is just have the same compositional issues that I care about present. But I made a goal, like roughly 2 weeks. I worked on a painting for 2 weeks, which they all fit into. So they were all done within 2 weeks versus my normal 3 months. And I found I wanted to be able to have the confidence to set a composition and then never change it and like work it. And just like have to deal with the struggle of the problems that are in front of me versus having the option to take things out. I don't like it, it's not working. So I learned a lot from both of them, and I don't know if anyone is more successful than the other, which is funny, so there's no right or wrong. So,
do you plan on doing anything with the photos that you documented that, you know?
Kind of. I kind of just want to keep it as my own personal little archive. I don't know if anyone would be ever interested in them, ever. But I think they're important for me if there's like a history, like a journal. Because when I'm in my studio, it's a very organic process. And when I sit there, I can only think about the one painting I'm working on. I can't have multiples that I'm working on at one time. And so when I sit there and I'm getting kind of close to the end of a piece, and I've sort of resolved the issues that I wanted to start off with and fight through. And then I think about, hey, I want to fight this problem. I want to like set up a new problem for me to figure out a way to resolve. And then I go from there, and then that's how I set up a new piece. And I can't think beyond that. I won't know what problems I want to solve until I'm close to finishing one painting, which is frustrating. But it sometimes I really wish I could work on many paintings at one time. I mean, that's not to say I do go back. Like if I leave a painting and I don't feel resolved with it, I will leave it for a few months and then I will go back. And then I'll be like, this needs to change. And then just from my mind, not from observation, I'll like be like playing colors and moving things around and making the shapes more interesting for myself. Yeah, I just painting, the whole process of painting, the significance of it, for me, when I make myself sit down and like, why do I paint? Why is this important? Like, what's the meaning of anything? I sit there and I'm like, well, really, right now, it's about communication. Like, because this is how I best think. This is how I like to think about the world. And so that must be important somehow. And so I sit there and I like, map my worldview almost. Like this is how I look at an image, this is how I look at the world, and I pick what's my priority and I try to like make it clear to the viewer. I'm sure it's probably not, everyone has different points of view, but I point like, this is my priority, and then now this is my priority, and this is what I want you to look at. And so it's really exciting for me to be here, and this is my worldview on a canvas, and I get to sit and stand next to other artists who have very different worldviews, but no one's more true. There's no more truth. No one's more true than anyone else. But I get to see how they look at the world and what's their priority, and then it makes me understand my world better. And it's very encouraging. So as of now, the reason why I paint is to learn about everyone else's worldview, and in the form of paint. It's really lovely. And I feel very honored to be a part of it. Yeah, not sure how else to go. Like, I love painting, and I'm happy to share it with all of you.
Can you think of maybe like one or two things that that painting informed you with for your others that maybe some of your paintings in the past, like some things you weren't thinking about?
How this painting informed all other paint, like the afterwards?
Yeah.
There was something about my obsession over this piece in particular, and my tight grip on trying to get something that was very frustrating and upset me for days, even if I wasn't working on it or even looking at it. I think this piece maybe, although I do appreciate this piece as it is and what I've gotten from it, upset me about painting. And I'm like, but I'm supposed to have joy about painting. Why? It shouldn't be yes, a struggle, always a struggle and upsetting to a degree, but also I need to accept the fact that there's joy. If there's no joy in making something, then why are you making yourself miserable? So I made myself a little bit miserable, but still I was a little masochistic a little bit for me personally. And so I was I'm just going to do a quicker painting, and I'm going to make sure I enjoy the strokes, the brush strokes. I'm just going to finish it when it's done, and then move on to something else and try to find joy in another piece. So.
Did the striped bottles have a meaning?
Well, I like bourbon, and they're bullet bourbon bottles. They're bullet bourbon bottles, yeah. So because I used a lot of, in previous paintings, my previous paintings were all white objects. I'm I'm just going to set, because I love Morandi, and I wanted to set up a still life with just all white things, and then I started to add a color here, and then a color there. And then I have boxes of fabrics that have been donated to me, and the but so I decided oh, now I'm going to take these objects, and I'm just going to, I paint bottles, solid colors, and acrylic paint. Just in that one there, you can just cover with a solid color, and then oh, I want to add a pattern, so I want to make it more confusing for me. I like really confusing spaces personally, and so that's why I chose to cover them. I went to a dollar store and bought striped wallpaper, wrapping paper, and then now I haven't used them yet, but I've been taking photos of my marks that I leave on paper towels from leftovers with my palette knife, and someone gave me Photoshop, and now I want to take Photoshop and multiply that image a bunch of times and then print it out and wrap it around stuff. So I want my marks to be the patterns in the paintings, but that isn't, I'm still teaching myself how to do that. So that's kind of the projected direction that they're going to, erasing form as far as I'm comfortable with. I want to make it uncomfortable for me to understand it.
Just to kind of follow up on that territory question I have, I guess, for both you and Laura, let's get open up to both, is where the observation and invention kind of intersect with each other in both of your paintings, and especially with pattern. You're describing the process a little bit about you actually make the bottles striped in a way, or is there some degree of that happens just on the painting as well, or back and forth, or is everything strictly observed, or that territory is just so interesting, I think, for both of you, and I'm curious about how it operates for both of your paintings.
It's primarily from observation, the mark making, but I'm trying to break from that a little bit and potentially keeping a painting from being completely finished to me and then having the setup is gone for like weeks, and I've been worked on other paintings, and then like sit there and try to understand how I should negotiate
So what
the
happens
space.
strictly with the painting itself after the subject is.
Yeah, it just adds a, I want to reach a maturity of like just understanding abstraction,
Yeah.
which I think I love observation, and I will always draw a lot from nature and things that are happen naturally and trying to catch it. But I think there's a certain maturity that comes with not, I think abstract painting is the hardest because to make it an interesting piece and something that's well conceived and designed, and I want to become more mature and like have a strong hand, and these are my shapes and I'm going to put them here, opposed to relying on something else. But I love observation, so trying to find a balance.
Just following up on that, so you set up the still life,
Mhm.
with fabrics and such, and
Yeah.
work from that for a while, and then you take that away and.
Recently, yeah. I think the past couple paintings I've worked on, I've been doing that. When I sit there and I'm just like mad at the painting for a while until I figure out how I can make myself not as angry at it and resolve it. Yeah, and I always use the same. And typically, I find a pattern and I like want to use it a lot, and I like to place it in different situations so I can understand the pattern better. So I see that blue, like that white pattern, that white fabric with the blue flowers on it, and that was that one too there, yeah. I feel like I'm at the end of it for right now, because I enjoy finding something new in it that I've never seen before. When you get to place it in a different situation next to different colors, it's my way for me to get something better, get more from it. But once I start to notice that I know how to paint it, and it's it's not a good idea, it's not good. So I think I'm done with that for a while. Retire, not to say that it's gonna be gone forever. I just started painting the other day with a fabric I used all the time in art school, all the time, and then I had to stop using it, and now I'm putting it in a different context with all my built up changing ideas of my painting, and now it's different, and it means something different. And it's actually the center point of the piece. It's the object is this pattern. So it's a lot of fun, and I'm really excited. Hopefully want to make my own patterns and see where that goes.
Well, and I think that's the perfect segue to
Yeah.
have Laura jump in and talk about the patterns that she's chosen to use in her work.
Okay. All right. So I guess just to give some background, it's fun to be in a show with Claire and her work hanging together because we were actually at PAPA at the same time, and we kind of both started painting patterns at about the same time.
Basically, yeah.
So it's interesting, but obviously, exploring them very differently. So for me, just to kind of back up, all the work in this show is pretty much from the last 4 years. It's not everything done in the last 4 years, but because I work very slowly, it represents everything from, that was 2011, to this one I just finished, so 2015. And kind of the journey of how I got there, when I was at PAFA, I always sort of, identified very much as a still life painter. Was always interested in objects and illusionism. So that's kind of, from still life, I started going in the direction more specifically of trompe-l'oeil, which is, for those who don't know, it's French, meaning to fool the eye. So, those paintings you've seen that are so illusionistic that it looks like you can just reach in and, touch whatever's in the painting. And so towards sort of the end of my time at PAFA, that kind of, that direction, going in that direction, I sort of pushed myself to, start working in a very, kind of with more sort of a minimal composition that narrowed the depth of field so you can get that sort of illusionism. So generally, maybe just working with one object and a flat sort of background. And I started introducing patterns because I always have loved, things that have tons of detail and complexity. And so the pattern became sort of a way of exploring, something that was detailed within that very flat, narrow depth of field. So, and then, it's interesting again with both of our works that the particular patterns that we choose. For me, I don't know about for you, but I think in the beginning I was just sort of picking patterns that I liked, without necessarily knowing why I liked them. And at some point, sort of after school, I wanted to challenge that a little bit more and have kind of more of a rationale of why I was picking the specific patterns that I was using. And so actually after I got to travel around Europe after I graduated, and I saw this amazing show called Cult of Beauty at the Victorian Albert Museum, which was sort of all about the aesthetic period and the Pre-Raphaelites, which is all this stuff that I always loved since like high school, but was not, that was like not an okay thing to like at Pathfinder. So I sort of hadn't looked at it in a long time. And through that, kind of got reintroduced, I guess, to William Morris, who was a British textile designer from the late 19th century. And he wasn't someone I necessarily looked at with the Pre-Raphaelites because he wasn't really a painter. He actually really couldn't paint at all. But he was a brilliant designer. So that was the first one that I did, and that's actually not William Morris, it's Walter Crane, who was kind of contemporary, and very similar, style of design. And I spent a while trying to figure out like what it is about his patterns, I guess, that I've loved so much. But I think it's something about the level of complexity and the beauty of the design and the shapes and the purity of the color. Because I think, again, it's interesting with Claire, having known your work and how monochromatic you were, and I also tended to be a lot more limited palette, and working from those patterns sort of helped me to kind of open up the palette that I was using. So from there, I've spent about 2 years actually. I took a brief break after that one and then didn't do William Morris for like a year. And then that was the second one that I did, the journal. And sort of from there, for the next like a year and a half, 2 years, I did all William Morris patterns in different sort of, configurations. Like sometimes sort of just the pattern, and then also with objects on top of the pattern, and sort of exploring that relationship between the interaction of the object with the pattern that happens there. And then the last one in the show is like the first thing that I did. No, actually both of those, I suppose. I started that one first though, then did that one and then finished that one, so kind of went back and forth. And they were both the first things I'd done that weren't William Morris in like 2 years. So that, is interesting to kind of come full circle and move beyond it. This piece was actually a commission from Mrs. here. But still very much, fit into the sort of, the vein of work that I have been doing. And then the last piece sort of came out of, there's always a tension thinking about sort of observation versus invention. I feel like I'm mainly on the observation side, but one thing that's been interesting for me is sort of the tension between found, setups that you come across and you see something and you want to paint it versus having the idea of it in your head and then sort of making it happen. And I've sort of been going more in the direction of having an idea and then having to, put it together and sort of realize it. But the frame kind of was a bit of both in a way, in that my day job when I'm not painting is that I work at a gallery. And we're not a contemporary art gallery, we sell 19th and 20th century art. And one thing that the owner is very big on is framing things in the correct period that the painting was produced in. And so something I've gotten to sort of learn and really enjoy from working there is the importance of frames. It's something I never thought about. And the frame as an object that's a work of art, that's a work of incredible craftsmanship. So after working there for years and just spending this time staring at these frames, I thought that would be a really fun idea for painting, just to paint the frame, not even anything in it. But then the specific frame, once I kind of had that idea, going about setting it up, I had to find a frame that I could borrow and the specific fabric I wanted to use with it, and then sort of set the whole thing up in a more sort of contrived way in the studio. So that's sort of a brief overview of everything. Anyone has questions?
Well, I have a couple questions from the students that
Okay.
I submitted. So I'll start with Claire. One person asked, what draws you to the colors you use in your compositions?
At first, it was random because they were gifts from my mother, who's an art teacher, an elementary school art teacher, and she just gave me fabrics. But I choose those fabrics based on within the pile, so I do choose these colors. Normally it comes to, I really want a dark spot here, and then from there it becomes a completely different painting than even what I conceived of at first. For instance, I'm trying to think, for the piece that's all the way back there, I knew there was a fabric I was given as a gift that looks like trees. It's essentially a silhouette of trees and it's purple. And I'm like, I want to make still life and landscape together. And then, but it's only, that was my priority when I started, but it's only a tiny part of the entire painting. So I have an idea, I really, particularly really enjoyed this fabric here, and there's a blue counterpart to it that I also really love. And it's also here. So normally I place it there and then I sit and I look and I wait. It's not so much about the color, it's about the weight of the colors in a composition that I'm more concerned about. I wanted the weight here, and I wanted compositions and movement to be happening in very specific directions as I sat and as it made me comfortable. But also I like being uncomfortable, so the comfort and my discomfort. How uncomfortable am I willing to be? It's uncomfortable enough to be my challenge for this particular painting. So that's it's very, kind of happens whimsically at that point. Yeah.
Okay, and I have a question for Laura. The student writes, I love your designs and compositions. How do you get ready for a painting? How do you organize the composition you want?
In terms of, I guess, organizing the composition, one thing that's been an interesting sort of exercise is within having objects that are very, very complex, having the composition itself be very minimal. Something that I really enjoy trying to do. So maybe the actual shape in the composition is literally just a rectangle on a rectangle, or a circle in a rectangle. And I think because of that, because it is so minimal, it does feel like the particular proportions within that matter a great deal. So usually, I'm thinking, with the frame as an example, once I determined sort of the elements, I picked the frame, and I knew I wanted something that wasn't gigantic, but that had some size, to it, so that I could have space around it without it becoming a really huge painting. Once I'd done that, I sort of just hung it and spent a lot of time doing just, I guess, not necessarily drawing so much. I've never been very comfortable actually with drawing itself, which is kind of funny. But more taping it off, literally. I'll tape off the fabric and I'll just try, okay, what if you have 2 inches of negative space on each side? What if it's 3, 4, doing, seeing the impact that has on the composition when you vary, because if there aren't that many elements, like I said, each element, each variable becomes so important, I think, to get it right. And the difference that it makes, the closer you crop it in, it becomes more about the frame. the more space you have, it could become really about the background. And with that one, I wanted both in a way. I wanted enough of the background so that you could really get a sense of the fabric, but still crop close enough that the frame, that you were drawn into the frame and what's inside the frame. So it's usually something about like that.
What about like the placement of the jewelry?
Yeah, so that was kind of an interesting case. It's also allowed, like, again, not necessarily drawing, but taking photographs, like reference photos, and cropping those. Like with that particular piece, what was interesting was this was an antique dealer I was working with, so I never really had that object in my possession. It was a very high value piece. So I went to his store, I photographed it, I had the pattern, like I had the actual paper pattern. So when I was in the store, I sort of photographed on the pattern just to kind of see, because one thing I'm really interested in is just the way the object, the shapes of the object, or the colors of the object might complement the design of the pattern. So I kind of determined that I wanted that particular object with that pattern. But then I basically had to come up with a composition without having the object. So I actually, like, this is kind of nutty. I had the pattern and I created like a paper mock-up of the object. Like I knew what the dimensions, what the measurements of it were. And so I sort of just traced out, drew it out at those measurements and then played around with moving it around the pattern until I found it, put it in a spot where I felt like, that was it. That seemed to really complement the two kind of, in a way, fused together. And, then I was able to go back, get the object, shoot it just the way I wanted it, and then paint it, work with the photograph. So once I get to determine the composition, the preparatory work, to some extent also varies, although for the most part, with most of these patterns, especially the William Morris, which are on paper and they're so complex, I don't draw them freehand. I trace them, which still takes a lot of time because you trace the pattern, which can take several days in itself, and then to transfer it, you draw on the other side to mark it with graphite, and then you draw on it again to mark it on the surface, and then usually just start painting the pattern sort of from the bottom up. And the object itself will kind of emerge on top of the pattern, rather than drawing the object first. With this one, this was a fun challenge because I couldn't trace that pattern. The fabric was really, had so much texture to it that I couldn't photocopy it. I couldn't even hold it up to a window and see through it. It was just so thick. So I drew it freehand because it wasn't that complex compared to the William Morris. So, that was a bit of an unusual case in the whole thing. I just spent a month or so drawing the whole, everything freehand. Yeah.
And then the question for Claire, and you started to allude to this. The student asked, did your works always include so many patterns, and what led you to include so many different patterns in your work? So maybe you can talk about your transition from
All white objects. Well, it's funny, I now only do, at the moment at least, I only do still life. But when I started going to PAFA, I was just like, I'm going to paint something important, and still life can't be important. And, I didn't know what was important or what I was supposed to do. And then I saw the Morandi show my first year at PAFA at the Met, and I'm like, this is important, but I don't know why. And I know everyone's freaking out about this show, and I'm trying to get it. And then I learned to paint, and I'm like, oh, this is why this is really significant to everyone. And I'm like, I want to try to just try to understand it. So I set up all white still lifes and white cups and other very big, very, very almost white fabrics. And then from there, I had a crib, and Stuart Shills, and he was just he was pushing me, add color, make it crazy. And and so I had a couple pieces of fabric just kind of lying around, and I'm like, oh, let's put this little piece underneath this cup. I'm like, oh, that's interesting how color interacts and makes that shape to make something unusual happen to the space. now the cup, even though it's back there, now feels like it's in the foreground. That's fun. And then from there, it just like, the collection began. And so that's the progress of that. And then now for me, still life is the most like significant to me at the moment way of painting and being in a studio. It mimics how I like to sit.
How long was that process?
I started doing still life my second year at PAFA on my own at home before we had our own studio spaces. And then so by the time I entered my studio at PAFA, most of the year I only did white, and then at the end I started to add color, and then things got more fun for me. And then, it took on its own, and it's a little story. I'm from New York, and my dad took classes at the Art Students League, and he was an illustrator, and so when he knew I was interested in painting in high school, he's like, oh, I'm taking you to the Art Students League, and you're going to take like classes, like figure drawing classes. And then I had this one professor, Leonid Lorman, this Russian artist, and he saw I was interested and I was really young in the class, and he's like, here's an assignment. He told me to make geometric drawings, like drawings of geometric white shapes, like a sphere and a cone, and just like to try to understand what form it is. And I just remember thinking, oh, so still life is just an exercise. And he just like drilled me for like forever. Like, and I'd bring in my drawing the next week, and then he'd send me home telling me what was wrong with it. And then I saw his work, and his work is very abstract, very conceptual. There was I thought he was just Russian. He just loves, that's what's important to him. From him, I learned that the form is very, very important to understand what that even means, and how it can take you other places with more meaning if you understand something that's seemingly simple, but not. So that's sort of, and so I thought it was funny. I kind of wanted to send him an email, actually. Like, hey, do you remember me? You had a huge significance on my life as a 16, 17-year-old about the conceptual meaning and form, or what that could be. We'll see. I have no plan of stopping doing still life, but I'm open to anything happening.
Another question for Nora. And this student references some pieces on your website, the Liam's Couch paintings, which are several views of a couch that has the same pattern. So this student asks, when doing similar paintings like Liam's Couch, how were you able to keep motivation or passion?
I don't know. I mean, I didn't really actually think about that when I was painting it, because to me they were all very different. And I mean, that was kind of part of the challenge. I wanted to take, I wanted to do a series. I wanted to have, have one sort of object in a sense of the couch, but do, close-ups of it from different views, so that in a way you're experiencing the whole thing, but through parts. So to me, every painting, and that was an interesting exercise, because I had one painting that was just the pattern. It was kind of like basically a close-up of the seat of the cushion, and you couldn't see any of the arms or whatever. And just that one, I was really able to focus on, or trying to focus on the painting the texture of the fabric. It was kind of an early piece of getting more into the texture, and I didn't necessarily have the time to, in my opinion, really do it justice. But really thinking about this actual stitch work of the pattern versus when you have some of the views that were a little bit more sort of backed up, where it felt like it was more painterly, and it was more about like the light, because it had kind of a satiny texture, so that the way the light would create a sheen off of the pattern. So I don't know, I never get bored painting these things, even when I look at them for a really, really, really long time. I think it's just the challenge. I mean, that's you know, working from observation is just, it's always, and I think, you know, with Claire too, you're painting the same things, but it's always new,
Right,
right?
yeah.
And it's always like a challenge every time.
Yeah, because the context you put that thing in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It always feels fresh.
Hopefully that answers that.
And then they have a few questions for both of you. What is your best advice to students that are graduating and just starting out? What is most important thing for them to do when beginning your career?
I think it's fun advice. I feel like I just graduated too. But it's been a few years though where I know, like, I love painting, but sometimes it's not fun to go into your studio and paint. And it's really hard to keep that momentum going, especially when you're not surrounded by other painters or students all the time. And so for me, my main goal was to maintain a momentum. And so a few days, like at least 3 or 4 days a week, I can make sure I'm in that studio and I'm painting, whether or not I'm mad about it. And I'm just have to do it because it's a job. And then afterwards, I always like a joy about, like I'm like satisfied with it. I'm glad I did it and I've learned something. So my advice would be just, no matter what job you have or other responsibilities, to try to like get it in an hour, get it in a half hour, read about art and what other artists are thinking and doing. Yeah, I mean, like I intentionally, since I graduated, I have intentionally made moves. I'm getting my BFA really, really slowly at another school, intentionally, because I want to paint. Like if I were to go, some people that works out great and fine, but for me, I knew it wouldn't, and I was afraid to like fall off. And then the jobs I have, it's like they're there to make painting the priority. So I go to a job at 6:30 in the morning, and I come home at like 4, and then I have a few hours before I have to go to bed and do it all over again or write a paper. So it's just always like you have to survive and pay your bills and be a responsible citizen, but making decisions to make it another job.
Do you have anything to add, Laura? I don't know, that
Summed it up pretty darn well.
Well, how about this final question then? How often does a piece turn out exactly as you had envisioned it? How do you feel about that?
Foolish
Yeah.
children.
Never. I mean, you know, well, I should say, I mean, unlike, you know, the experience it sounds like you had with that one, where you were really pushing yourself to maybe let it develop and change it and paint over and
Be
over.
obsessive.
Well, not just be obsessive, but also be like, you know, flexible to changing it, letting it develop. Like, I do have always an end idea. Like, I know I want it to, I mean, you never know what it's going to look like. Obviously, if you did, why would you paint it in a sense? But I do, you know, I don't really ever do a painting where it's like, oh, I'm actually going to take this object out. Like that sort of, you know, variable or dramatic change doesn't usually happen along the way. So in that sense, I have an end goal, and it's just a slow progression of getting there. But there's always, I mean, it never turns out quite the way you just never know what it's going to look like as you're going along the way, and that's kind of the fun of it, is discovering as you're working.
Yeah.
And learning, I guess. For me, I think you sort of mentioned this too. You know, working with objects. There's something about like, learning about the object. I felt that especially with this spring painting. This was probably almost the longest I've ever worked on a painting. I started it in like January, and so, you know, I felt like, and especially also with the job that I have and working with frame makers, you know, I felt like in some sense I was also learning about the frame as I was painting it, and getting, you know, just every little groove and divot, and you know, it's like you're not actually making the object. Well, in a sense you are, and so that discovery of learning about something as you're trying to paint it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of that. Also, just to like add on a little thing for me, I know that I noticed when I paint, like if I go, like it never comes out how I thought it would. And if I ever am painting and I'm getting this in and I feel happy about it, I'm like, this is not good, this is not good. And I end up realizing that like months later, I'm like, yeah, this painting was not that great because it didn't upset me enough. It didn't challenge me enough in like ways like, oh, what's so different about this? Why is it so like off-putting to me. It's because I'm challenged because it's more interesting now. And so now I know I'm always gonna hate it all the time. And then eventually, a little bit more perspective on it. I'm like, okay, yeah, it's fine. I hate it.
Do you hate it now?
Sometimes. It's funny to see him in person. Yeah. Because it is like, it's like a painting for me at least. It's like a really personal, it's not a diary. I'm not necessarily sentimental about the objects. I don't want to go, I'm afraid to ever become sentimental. That's when I stop using them, is when I become sentimental to them. Yeah, it is just personal because I have problems that I created that I want to solve. And there they are, my mistakes, how I figured it out. In my mind, I see all the history that went into it and the mental struggle that it takes. So it's a little funny. Like, there's a page of my diary. Hello everyone, hope you enjoy. I hope you do, but it's just funny to see it as that person.
Does anyone else have any questions? This is all from the students.
I guess along the lines of what you were just saying, like coming from a very concrete thinking perspective, if you have something in front of you that you're painting, wouldn't you kind of expect it to turn out like what you're looking at? Like, I realize that probably sounds really dumb, but I'm also like a choreographer, so I see a dance in my head and it turns out like I see it. So I guess I'm a little confused as to why when you're putting a piece of art, like do you allow it to change that much along the way, or you don't want to start with a concrete image of what you want it to end up as?
Well, for me, no, I think it's really interesting. But I think it's coming to terms. I sit there and when I look at things, like as anyone looks at things, depending on, well, maybe it's just me, so I won't speak for anyone else. But I'm sitting there looking at something. There's two separate eyeballs with taking in different information differently, and light's changing and the atmosphere changing, and how your eye focuses on something changes the color of something that's happening over there. And so it's never, for me at least, it's never like, oh, this is what it is.
Okay.
It's like, it's dependent on a color that's over there. And so when I'm painting something, like if I decide to make something blue or green, it's going to change how I want to paint the other parts of the painting.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and I think of like, and I like to think of painting. Now you're not like painting you're putting spots of color, and so you're not painting the thing. So it's like it's like a fun play of this is the thing physically, but this is how the spots of color are going to communicate those things.
Interesting.
So I like it.
Yeah. And I have a hard time knowing you and knowing your choreography. Like, I still would imagine you have moments where you go, oh, I didn't expect it to look like that, you know, when you actually see everyone dancing. And I think, you know, there's also, you know, they're not photographs. And so, especially, the difference for me between actually doing one that was from a photograph, which I don't normally do, and then going back to doing one from life, and with this, you know, that in particular, that object, it just changed constantly. Like, I could be sitting there painting it, and I would move, you know, a millimeter to the right, and it looked completely different because the light reflected the gold completely differently. Or sometimes I take a break for lunch and come back, and the light would have changed, you know, the whole thing would have shifted entirely.
Yeah.
So, and while I was trying to capture what it looked like, it never looked the same. So at some point I had to kind of decide, well, I'm painting it to this, you know, light at this time of day. But at the same time, there were also probably other ways in which I wasn't entirely faithful to that.
Sure.
So in a way, like the object looking like that might never have existed, you know, it might never look exactly like that. Because I'm still, you know, I wasn't being absolutely like, you know, super literal about it, where I was like, okay, it's 10 in the morning, and I'm only painting the frame the way it looks at 10 in the morning. So, you know, there were still times, and you have to make decisions then. Like there were, you know, I kept coming back to sometimes, you know, especially like the lower part of the frame. It was fascinating the way the light hit it and reflected off of the ridges depending on the angle of the sun. You know, and of course we've also now gone through a big change in, you know, seasons. So the lights also interacting totally differently. So basically deciding like, well, you know, do I want this area to stay more in shadow, or do I want to paint it so that the light is catching and reflecting, on the ridge at every single little point? You're making decisions that makes it so that it's not ever turning out exactly the way it looked when you were sitting there. If that makes sense.
No, it does. That makes a lot of sense, actually. Thank you.
You alluded to the differences with light both throughout the day and as the seasons change. Is there a particular time of day or season when you favor the light more, or is that just something you approach as a challenge to embrace, even though it's always changing? Or is there a particular
No,
time?
I don't like that challenge. But you can't, no, that's not true. It is fun. No, it's a tension, I guess, between, the interest of sort of chasing it, but also being someone who very much likes things to be exactly the way I want them to be. And that was what was so fascinating about going from working with the photograph, which in so many ways was just so much easier. And I did enjoy it, but when I went back to this one, I kind of realized I feel like I was missing something there a little bit. Maybe it didn't have sort of the depth that it might have had because of that challenge, because of what that challenge introduces. But I definitely like it when, right now the days are so short, that's one frustrating thing. And going back to working from life, I would run into that, when I was working on this one in October even when the light hadn't completely gone down, it would get to be about 4 or 5, and it would have gone down enough that it just changed too dramatically and you had to stop working. So I would love it if it stayed when it's most consistent. I also have a studio, I used to have a studio that was north facing, which is like the most consistent light, which is very nice. And now my studio is south and west facing, I think.
Wow.
So just forget it, it's just changing. I get sometimes I would even get like the really strong sort of light patterns either hitting me or the setup. So it's always an interesting struggle.
Well, thank you guys.
Yeah.
Of course.